Military strategy sessions across the galaxy typically follow a predictable pattern. Inflate egos, deflate common sense, and somehow convince everyone present that complexity equals competence. The Terran Defense Coalition's orbital command station exemplified this principle with breathtaking efficiency, its chrome-plated conference room buzzing with the sort of self-important energy that could power a small moon. Representatives from 12 species had gathered around a holographic display table that cost more than most planetary defense budgets. The Zephyrian delegate, whose crystalline exoskeleton caught the ambient lighting in precisely the pretentious way evolution had intended, gestured dramatically at tactical projections that shifted and morphed with each theatrical wave of his 6 arms. Beside him, the Corvallan military attaché, a being whose species had perfected the art of looking perpetually constipated through sheer evolutionary spite, studied data streams with the intensity of someone trying to divine the meaning of existence from quarterly profit reports. The centerpiece of their heated debate was a worn, leather-bound manual that sat incongruously among the sleek holographic interfaces. Asymmetric Warfare, a comprehensive guide to defeating superior forces, had become something of a religious text among galactic military circles, passed from species to species like some kind of tactical gospel. The fact that none of them could pronounce the author's name properly hadn't diminished their reverence for its contents one bit. According to Section 7.3 of the manual, the Zephyri announced with the sort of gravitas typically reserved for pronouncing death sentences, we must consider the psychological impact of perceived weakness as a strategic advantage. He paused dramatically, as if he'd just solved the unified field theory rather than reading from a book. The author demonstrates remarkable insight into the nature of asymmetric conflict. The Corvallans' throat sacs inflated with approval, a biological response their species had evolved to express agreement, though it unfortunately resembled the mating display of several less intellectually advanced creatures. Indeed, the manual's approach to resource allocation in Chapter 12 revolutionized our understanding of logistics management. Whoever wrote this masterpiece clearly possesses a military mind far beyond anything we've encountered. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by a decorative potted plant that probably cost more than most beings' annual salaries, sat a young human female. She occupied the sort of chair typically reserved for junior staff members, uncomfortable, poorly positioned, and clearly designed to remind its occupant of their place in the pecking order. Her standard-issue coalition uniform was pristine but unremarkable, bearing the insignia of a civilian consultant. The kind of person who existed in military hierarchy somewhere between necessary evil and living furniture. The assembled military minds had acknowledged her presence with the sort of perfunctory politeness usually extended to maintenance droids and catering staff. After all, she was human. A species whose greatest military achievement, according to galactic consensus, was somehow avoiding complete extinction despite their apparent talent for creative self-destruction. The Coalition had insisted on human representation in strategic planning sessions, but everyone understood this was merely a diplomatic gesture, like putting a child's drawing on the refrigerator. It was about inclusion rather than actual value. The brilliance of the manual's deception strategies, continued a hegemony representative whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a praying mantis and a tax auditor, lies in its understanding that enemies consistently underestimate unconventional approaches. The irony of this statement, delivered while systematically ignoring the most unconventional element in the room, was apparently lost on everyone present. The human girl shifted slightly in her chair, a movement that went unnoticed by the tactical geniuses debating the finer points of military theory. She'd been listening to their analysis for the better part of 3 hours, watching with growing amusement as they dissected strategies with the enthusiasm of art critics examining a particularly complex abstract painting. The fact that they kept misinterpreting key concepts would have been concerning if it weren't so entertainingly predictable. Chapter 15's discussion of terrain exploitation, the Zephyrian continued, now consulting his personal notes with religious fervor, suggests that environmental advantages can be manufactured rather than simply discovered. The author's insight into adaptive battlefield psychology is revolutionary. He looked around the table expectantly, basking in the reflected glory of someone else's intellectual achievement. The holographic display flickered through various battle simulations, each more elaborate than the last. Tactical formations danced across 3-dimensional space like some kind of deadly ballet, while probability calculations scrolled past in streams of incomprehensible mathematics. The technology was impressive, the analysis was thorough, and the conclusions were spectacularly wrong. The human girl bit back a smile as she watched them puzzle over a particularly straightforward concept from Chapter 8. The section on resource denial through apparent cooperation had been written during a particularly caffeine-fueled all-nighter, inspired by watching her roommate's cat pretend to be friendly while systematically destroying houseplants. The fact that galactic military academies now taught courses based on feline behavior patterns was either deeply concerning or absolutely hilarious, depending on one's perspective. We must, however, acknowledge our limitations, the Corvallan delegate intoned solemnly, his throat sacs deflating to express appropriate humility. The manual's author clearly possessed insights into warfare that transcend conventional military thinking. Perhaps we should focus on implementation rather than attempting to improve upon perfection. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled representatives. The human girl watched this display of intellectual surrender with the sort of fascination typically reserved for observing particularly elaborate train wrecks. These were beings whose species had mastered faster-than-light travel, artificial intelligence, and the art of making committee meetings last exactly twice as long as necessary. Yet here they sat, stumped by strategic concepts that had originated from a graduate student's thesis on historical military failures. The hegemony representative gestured toward a complex tactical formation displayed in the hologram. The author's emphasis on adaptive improvisation suggests that rigid planning may be counterproductive. However, the precise implementation of such flexibility remains unclear, the creature's compound eyes fixed on the manual with something approaching religious devotion. If only we could consult with the author directly. Impossible, declared the Zephyrium with the finality of someone stating a universal law. Intelligence suggests the author remains anonymous for security reasons. Clearly, someone of such strategic brilliance must be protected from enemy assassination attempts. The logic was impeccable, the reasoning sound, and the conclusion completely divorced from reality. The human girl finally allowed herself a small smile. After 3 hours of watching the galaxy's finest military minds worship at the altar of her undergraduate work, she was beginning to understand why comedy writers across the universe never lacked for material. The fact that none of them had bothered to check the publication records of Earth's military academies said more about galactic intelligence gathering than any strategic manual ever could. As the debate continued to spiral into increasingly complex interpretations of fundamentally simple concepts, the girl settled back into her uncomfortable chair and prepared for what promised to be a very entertaining afternoon. After all, they hadn't even reached the really interesting parts yet. The tactical analysis had reached that peculiar stage of group delusion where everyone pretends to understand concepts that would baffle theoretical physicists. The Zephian delegate had appointed himself chief interpreter of the manual's wisdom, a role he embraced with the enthusiasm of a prophet discovering a new scripture written in convenient bullet points. "Listen to this profound observation from chapter 21, he announced, his crystalline voice carrying across the command center with ceremonial gravity. The author states, and I quote, "Victory often belongs not to the strongest force, but to the one willing to embrace apparent disadvantage as strategic opportunity." He paused to let this revelation sink into the collective consciousness of beings whose idea of strategic thinking typically involved throwing larger ships at smaller problems. The human girl's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline as she recognized the passage. She remembered writing that particular gem at 3 in the morning after a marathon study session on historical military disasters. The profound insight had been inspired by watching a documentary about small-town basketball teams beating urban powerhouses through sheer, bloody-minded persistence and creative rule interpretation. The fact that it now served as tactical gospel for species capable of cracking planets like walnuts suggested the universe possessed a sense of irony that bordered on the malicious. "Revolutionary thinking," breathed Corvallan, his throat sacs pulsing in a rhythm that his species associated with deep philosophical contemplation, but which resembled nothing so much as a malfunctioning air filtration system. The author understands that conventional military doctrine often becomes its own worst enemy. The assembled military minds nodded with the sort of synchronized solemnity typically reserved for funeral services or budget meetings. None of them seemed particularly concerned that they were basing their strategic planning on the musings of a species they collectively regarded as barely evolved primates with delusions of competence. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position would have impressed psychologists across 12 star systems. Chapter 37 contains perhaps the most brilliant tactical insight in military literature, declared the hegemony representative, his mandibles clicking in excitement. The author describes something called productive chaos theory, the deliberate introduction of unpredictable elements to disrupt enemy calculations. He gestured dramatically at the holographic display, where tactical formations shifted into increasingly complex patterns. The mathematical elegance is breathtaking. The human girl bit her lip to suppress what would have been a very inappropriate laugh. Productive chaos theory had been her advisor's polite term for making stuff up as you go along and hoping for the best. The mathematical elegance consisted primarily of her roommate's game theory homework, which she'd borrowed without permission after running out of legitimate research sources. The fact that galactic military academies now offered advanced courses in applied randomness suggested that academic integrity was apparently a species-specific concept. The Corvalan began reading directly from the manual, his voice taking on the reverent tones of someone reciting sacred texts. In asymmetric warfare, the appearance of incompetence can be the highest form of strategy. The enemy who underestimates chaotic elements will invariably miscalculate response parameters. He looked up from the page with something approaching awe. The author's understanding of psychological manipulation transcends anything in our military archives. What the author had actually understood was that her professor graded on creativity rather than conventional wisdom, and that padding a thin thesis with psychological jargon was significantly easier than conducting actual research. The section on chaotic elements had been inspired by watching her younger brother's soccer team accidentally win a tournament through a combination of rule misunderstandings and aggressive snack consumption. Military psychology, as it turned out, had more in common with youth sports than anyone cared to acknowledge. The manual's treatment of resource scarcity is particularly enlightening, continued the Zephyrian, now completely absorbed in his role as High Priest of human military wisdom. Chapter 42 demonstrates how limitations can be transformed into advantages through creative reinterpretation of available assets. He paused dramatically, allowing the profundity of this insight to permeate the room like expensive cologne. The human girl had to admire the alien's talent for finding deep meaning in what had essentially been a chapter about making do with whatever happened to be lying around. The creative reinterpretation of available assets had been her diplomatic way of describing the time-honored military tradition of improvising solutions from whatever materials weren't supposed to be used for that purpose. She'd illustrated the concept with historical examples, ranging from using naval vessels as artillery platforms to converting agricultural equipment into armored vehicles, never imagining that beings capable of faster-than-light travel would treat such improvisations as revolutionary insights. The hegemony representative had pulled up additional tactical simulations, each more elaborate than the last. The author's emphasis on adaptive flexibility suggests that rigid command structures may be inherently vulnerable to unconventional responses. His compound eyes fixed on a particularly complex formation displayed in the hologram. However, implementing such flexibility requires understanding principles that seem almost intuitive to the author, but remain frustratingly opaque to conventional analysis. The principles in question had been frustratingly opaque to their author as well, which was why she'd written them in the deliberately vague language that professors mistook for sophisticated theoretical framework. The adaptive flexibility concept had emerged from her observation that successful improvisation looked like genius in retrospect, but felt like panic while it was happening. Academic military theory, she'd discovered, had a remarkable capacity for transforming common sense into incomprehensible complexity. We must consider the possibility, the Corvalan said slowly, his throat sacs deflating to express appropriate humility, that our understanding of these concepts remains fundamentally limited by our conventional military background. The author clearly possessed insights that transcend traditional strategic thinking. The human girl watched this display of intellectual surrender with growing fascination. These beings had mastered technologies that her species could barely comprehend, commanded fleets that could reshape solar systems, and possessed collective military experience spanning millennia. Yet here they sat, baffled by strategic concepts that had originated from a graduate student's desperate attempt to meet a thesis deadline. The irony was so thick it could have been used as defensive armor plating. Perhaps, suggested the Zephyrian with the sort of careful reverence typically reserved for approaching dangerous religious topics, we should focus on precise implementation of the manual's recommendations, rather than attempting to innovate beyond the author's established framework. The suggestion was met with solemn nods from around the table, as if he'd proposed the only sensible approach to handling divine revelation. The tactical displays continued their elaborate dance of formations and probability calculations, each scenario more complex than the last. The assembled military minds studied these projections with the intensity of scholars examining ancient texts, searching for hidden meanings in strategic concepts that had been written with all the subtlety of a construction manual. The technology was magnificent, The analysis was thorough, and the fundamental understanding remained spectacularly absent. As the debate continued to spiral into increasingly elaborate interpretations of fundamentally straightforward ideas, the human girl settled deeper into her uncomfortable chair and prepared for what promised to be an afternoon of escalating absurdity. The real entertainment was yet to come, after all. They hadn't even reached the sections where she'd gotten creative, with historical examples and theoretical frameworks. A chapter on controlled incompetence as strategic deception alone would probably keep them busy for hours. The moment of tactical enlightenment arrived with all the subtle grace of a supernova in a library. The Zephyrian delegate had been expounding on the manual's chapter 53, weaving elaborate theoretical frameworks around what the author had originally intended as a straightforward discussion of battlefield communication protocols. His interpretation, while impressively creative, bore roughly the same relationship to the original text that abstract expressionism bore to technical drawing. The station, the author's concept of deliberate miscommunication as tactical advantage, he declared with the confidence of someone who had never doubted anything in his crystalline existence, clearly advocates for the systematic distribution of false intelligence through apparent coordination failures. He gestured grandly at the holographic display where tactical formations had begun to resemble the sort of modern art that made viewers question the nature of reality itself. The human girl felt her eye begin to twitch, a small, involuntary response that would have been imperceptible to anyone not intimately familiar with the subtle signs of mounting exasperation. The chapter in question had been about the importance of clear communication during combat operations, illustrated with historical examples of military disasters caused by ambiguous orders and translation errors. The idea that it advocated for deliberate confusion would have been hilarious if it weren't about to get people killed. Fascinating interpretation, murmured the Corvallan, his throat sacs oscillating in what his species considered deep contemplation, but which looked disturbingly like a digestive process. However, I must question whether the author intended such complexity. Perhaps the passage refers to more conventional deception protocols? Zephyrian's exoskeleton shimmered with dismissive superiority. Conventional thinking is precisely what the manual warns against. The author's genius lies in recognizing that apparent simplicity often conceals profound strategic depth. He turned to address the room with evangelical fervor. We must embrace the complexity of concepts that transcend our limited understanding. This was the moment when the human girl's patience, which had been stretched thinner than diplomatic protocol, finally reached its breaking point. The sight of beings capable of manipulating gravity, discussing the profound complexity of basic communication skills, proved too much for her increasingly strained composure. Actually, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the debate with the unexpected impact of common sense in a bureaucratic meeting, that section is about preventing communication failures, not causing them. The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with funeral services, or the moment when everyone realizes they've been singing the wrong words to the national anthem. 12 pairs of alien eyes turned toward the corner of the room where the human girl sat, their expressions ranging from mild surprise to outright incredulity that the furniture had developed opinions. I beg your pardon, the Zephyrian's voice carried the sort of polite condescension usually reserved for correcting small children who had announced their intention to become professional unicorns. The girl straightened in her uncomfortable chair, feeling the weight of collective attention like a physical force. Chapter 53. It's about establishing clear communication protocols to prevent the kind of coordination failures that led to the Martian colony disaster in 2387. She gestured toward the manual with the casual familiarity of someone who knew exactly where every citation could be found. The deliberate miscommunication interpretation would actually contradict the central theses of the entire work. The assembled military minds exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their collective assessment of human intellectual capacity. The Corvallan's throat sacs deflated in what his species probably considered a diplomatic expression of disagreement, but which resembled nothing so much as a slow air leak. While we appreciate human perspectives, he said with the careful tone of someone addressing a particularly enthusiastic but misguided intern, the manual's complexity requires extensive military training to properly comprehend. The author's strategic insights operate on theoretical levels that may not be immediately apparent to civilian observers. The condescension in his voice was so thick it could have been bottled and sold as industrial lubricant. The human girl felt her jaw clench as she recognized the familiar pattern of being dismissed by beings who had apparently learned everything they knew about military strategy from her undergraduate thesis, while simultaneously believing that her species was too primitive to understand military strategy. The theoretical levels, she replied with the sort of calm that preceded either enlightenment or explosions, include footnotes referencing Earth's military history database, citations from the Coalition Defense Academy archives, and case studies from conflicts that involved human forces. She paused to let this information penetrate the wall of collective certainty that surrounded the table. The author clearly had access to specifically human military perspectives. The hegemony representative's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or digestive activity. An interesting observation, but hardly conclusive. Many scholars have studied human conflicts as examples of primitive but occasionally effective tactical approaches. His compound eyes fixed on her with a sort of clinical interest usually reserved for examining particularly interesting bacteria cultures. The manual's brilliance lies in recognizing the occasional utility of such unrefined methods. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position was truly impressive. Here sat beings who had spent the afternoon worshipping the strategic genius of human military thinking while simultaneously explaining why humans were too unsophisticated to understand human military thinking. The universe's sense of irony had apparently evolved a sense of humor somewhere along the way. The unrefined methods, the girl said slowly, each word carefully measured like ammunition in a precision weapon, include detailed analysis of asymmetric warfare principles, resource optimization algorithms, and psychological operations theory. The mathematical frameworks alone reference advanced concepts in game theory and strategic decision analysis. She had their attention now, though whether it was the sort of attention accorded to a brilliant insight or a fascinating train wreck remained unclear. The Zephyrines' exoskeleton had shifted to a color that probably indicated either deep thought or mild indigestion, while the Corvallin's throat sacs had achieved a state of complete stillness that suggested his species' equivalent of holding one's breath. Moreover, she continued, warming to her subject despite the surrounding atmosphere of polite skepticism, the historical examples include several conflicts where human forces successfully employed asymmetric tactics against technologically superior opponents. The Battle of Kepler Station, the Titan Mining Rebellion, the successful defense of the Outer Rim colonies, all conflicts where supposedly primitive human thinking overcame conventional military wisdom. The silence that followed was pregnant with the sort of implications that made military planners nervous and diplomatic corps reach for emergency contact protocols. The assembled delegates began to exhibit the sort of subtle behavioral changes that suggested their collective worldview was experiencing unexpected turbulence. "You seem remarkably well informed about the manual's contents," the Zephyrian observed, with the cautious tone of someone approaching a potentially dangerous philosophical precipice. "Have you perhaps studied this work extensively?" The human girl looked around the table at faces that ranged from mildly curious to deeply concerned, and realized that she had reached the point where retreat was no longer possible and advance might prove catastrophic. The strategic situation, as the manual itself might have observed, called for a calculated risk. "You could say that," she replied with a smile that contained more implications than a diplomatic treaty. "I'm intimately familiar with the author's thinking. The revelation arrived with all the devastating precision of a tactical nuclear device detonated in a philosophy classroom." The human girl reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small, worn identification card, the sort of mundane bureaucratic artifact that typically held about as much strategic significance as a grocery list. She placed it carefully on the polished conference table, where it lay like an unexploded ordnance device among the holographic projections and tactical displays. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she announced calmly, her voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made seasoned military officers reconsider their career choices. "Department of Strategic Studies, Coalition Defense Academy, author of Asymmetric Warfare, A Comprehensive Guide to Defeating Superior Forces, published as my doctoral dissertation in 2394. The silence that followed possessed the quality of a vacuum, not merely the absence of sound, but the complete annihilation of everything that might have become sound if reality hadn't suddenly developed a severe case of existential confusion. 12 alien faces stared at the identification card as if it were a particularly malevolent artifact from some hostile dimension where cause and effect had been replaced by cosmic practical jokes. The Zephyrian delegate's crystalline exoskeleton cycled through approximately 17 different colors before settling on a shade that his species typically reserved for moments of profound philosophical crisis. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried the strangled quality of someone whose worldview had just been fed through an industrial shredder. "You're the author," he managed. the words emerging with the sort of careful deliberation usually employed when diffusing explosive devices or explaining quantum mechanics to particularly dim children. The same author, she confirmed with a smile that could have powered several small civilizations, whose strategic genius you've been analyzing for the past 4 hours. The same author whose insights transcend conventional military thinking. The same author whose work represents the pinnacle of tactical brilliance across 12 star systems. She paused, to survey the collection of alien faces that had achieved various stages of mortification. The same author you've been explaining military strategy to while insisting that her species lacks the intellectual capacity to understand military strategy. The Corvallin's throat sacs had achieved a state of complete deflation that suggested his species' equivalent of a catatonic episode. When he finally spoke, his voice resembled the sound of air escaping from a punctured philosophy textbook. "But you're human," he whispered, as if stating a fundamental law of physics that had suddenly decided to file for retirement. "Guilty as charged," she replied cheerfully. "The same species you spent the morning describing as barely evolved primates with delusions of military competence. The same species whose tactical approaches you characterized as primitive but occasionally useful. The same species whose representative you've been treating like decorative furniture while consulting her work as if it were revealed truth from the gods of warfare." The hegemony representative's mandibles had locked in a position that suggested his cognitive processes had encountered a fatal error and were currently attempting to restart from backup files. The mathematical impossibility of the situation had apparently overloaded his species' considerable intellectual capacity. Around the table, military minds that had spent decades mastering the complexities of interstellar warfare struggled with the fundamental revelation that their sacred text had been written by someone they'd collectively dismissed as intellectually inferior. The irony was so pure it could have been refined into weapons-grade philosophical ammunition. "The really amusing part," the girl continued, the sort of gentle malice typically reserved for correcting particularly arrogant professors, "is that everything you've been saying about the manual is absolutely correct. It does represent revolutionary thinking about asymmetric warfare. It does contain insights that transcend conventional military wisdom. It does demonstrate a profound understanding of strategic psychology." She gestured toward the assembled delegates with theatrical grandeur. "You've just spent 4 hours proving that human military thinking is brilliant, while simultaneously arguing that humans are too stupid to understand military thinking." The universe, it seemed, had finally perfected the art of cosmic comedy. In a conference room designed to coordinate the defense of civilized space, the galaxy's finest military minds had discovered that their most sacred strategic doctrine had been written by a member of the very species they'd gathered to protect from its own supposed incompetence. The tactical displays continued their silent dance of formations and probability calculations, blissfully unaware that their operators had collectively suffered what psychologists would later classify as acute paradigm displacement syndrome. The technology hummed with quiet efficiency while its users grappled with the existential implications of having their entire strategic framework authored by someone they just finished explaining couldn't possibly understand strategic frameworks, the girl said conversationally, settling back into her uncomfortable chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just won an argument with the universe itself. "Shall we continue with the tactical analysis? Because I noticed you completely misinterpreted the section on resource allocation. Your understanding of adaptive command structures would make my undergraduate students weep, and your implementation of psychological operations theory violates about 6 fundamental principles of strategic deception." She glanced around the table at expressions that ranged from shell-shocked to quietly homicidal. "Or we could spend another few hours discussing how primitive human thinking occasionally produces useful insights. I'm flexible." The Zephyrian delegate's exoskeleton had settled on a color that his species typically associated with divine revelation mixed with acute embarrassment. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should reconsider our analytical approach." The girl's smile could have been classified as a strategic weapon in several jurisdictions. Now there's a revolutionary idea, and somewhere in the quantum foam of space-time, the fundamental forces of irony were probably laughing themselves into alternate dimensions.